Caroline Hayes stepped off the bus on the first day at Lincoln High, her polished leather shoes hitting the cracked pavement with a quiet authority. She adjusted her blazer, glanced at the graffiti-streaked brick walls, and took a slow, steadying breath. The school smelled of stale cafeteria food, cleaning chemicals, and a faint hint of fear, the invisible aura of a place where discipline was more suggestion than rule. Students milled about in clusters, some slouching with headphones in, others leaning against lockers with arms crossed, eyeing every newcomer like a predator sizing up prey. Caroline's reputation preceded her only in whispers among the staff. She was a new hire, quiet, professional, and unusually composed, yet there were rumors, half-hearted gossip about a mysterious past, hints that she wasn't just a teacher but had been somewhere else before, somewhere dangerous. Most teachers avoided speculation. They had learned that curiosity could lead to awkward or even uncomfortable questions. Caroline herself had made it clear she wouldn't entertain inquiries. Some thought it was arrogance. Others sensed a hidden strength beneath her calm exterior. Among the students, though, one noticed her differently. Taylor. He was a senior, 6'2", broad-shouldered, with a reputation that preceded him far beyond the walls of Lincoln High. Had been expelled, suspended, or punished for nearly every form of misbehavior imaginable: fights in the hallways, altercations in the cafeteria, verbal confrontations with teachers. His anger was legendary, fueled by a mix of familial instability, gang pressures, and the constant feeling that no one, not even the adults, understood him. When first saw Caroline walk into the classroom, he immediately assessed her. She moved deliberately, almost gracefully, yet without pretense. Her brown hair was tied neatly behind her head, eyes sharp, observant, and unnervingly steady. She didn't flinch when students whispered or nudged each other to watch her. She simply observed, measured, and ignored the chaos around her. Smirked. A teacher who didn't react, she had to be weak. Surely he could push her around, prove himself, and earn the laughter of the classroom. By the time the first lesson began, Caroline had already noticed sharp eyes following her every move. Unlike many others, he didn't hide his challenge. It radiated off him in waves of simmering hostility. She didn't need to see his disciplinary record to recognize the danger he carried. Was volatile, unpredictable, and used confrontation like a weapon. But Caroline didn't flinch, didn't raise her voice, and didn't try to control him with empty threats. She simply began the lesson, her voice calm, steady, carrying a subtle authority that drew attention without demanding it. The classroom murmurs swirled around them like static electricity. Students exchanged glances, whispering about the new teacher who never seemed intimidated, who never raised her voice, and who stared back with the faintest trace of challenge in her eyes. She wasn't passive, but she wasn't aggressive either. Felt it like a provocation. For the first time in weeks, he wanted to break someone, not just to assert dominance, but because he had met someone who wouldn't bend to him. The days that followed didn't ease his curiosity or frustration. Every time he tried to push Caroline, throwing papers, speaking out of turn, mocking her in front of the class, she responded the same way, calm, measured, unshaken. Began to feel something unfamiliar, irritation. She wasn't afraid. She wasn't angry. She simply existed in her own space like an immovable object that refused to be swayed by his force. It confused him, enraged him, and strangely intrigued him. Other students began to notice too. "Why doesn't she care?" one whispered. "Doesn't she see what he's doing?" another asked. The mystery surrounding Caroline deepened. Reputation made her classroom a minefield, yet she navigated it effortlessly, using nothing more than her presence and a calm voice. Some teachers had warned her not to engage, to avoid confrontation, but Caroline understood something they didn't. Anger could be redirected, not just suppressed, and respect could be demanded without shouting. His world outside school was chaotic. At home, his father was absent, his mother overworked, and the streets offered an escape he didn't fully understand but instinctively relied on. He carried all of it into the classroom, the pent-up rage, the distrust, the need to assert power. Caroline noticed it not through words but in his posture, in the subtle flinch in his fingers, the way he shifted weight from foot to foot as if ready to explode. Yet she didn't lecture. She didn't confront him openly. She simply observed, aware that a single misstep could ignite a disaster. It wasn't long before the tension reached a silent peak. Decided she would be an easy target to dominate. He started planning subtle provocations, questions designed to corner her, interruptions meant to embarrass her, small acts of defiance to test her limits. But every time he tried, Caroline responded with calm clarity. Her authority wasn't loud or domineering, it was quiet and absolute. Couldn't understand it. He had never met someone like her. Every failed attempt fueled his determination, a slow burn of frustration that he didn't even fully realize was building inside him. Outside observers might have thought the tension harmless, a typical student-teacher clash. But Caroline saw the danger clearly. Wasn't testing her curiosity or her knowledge. He was testing boundaries, patience, and ultimately control. Every class, every interaction, every silent stare in the hallway was a move in a psychological chess game didn't fully comprehend. Caroline didn't need to raise her voice or strike fear. Her very presence was a containment mechanism, subtle, precise, and deliberate. By the end of the first week, whispers about Caroline Hayes had spread through the school. Teachers speculated, students gossiped, and seethed privately. He knew one thing for certain. She would not bow, flinch, or back down. And in his mind, that meant only one thing: he had to escalate. Caroline, meanwhile, reflected quietly at the end of her day. She knew was dangerous, yes, but she also recognized the familiar patterns of anger, fear, and pressure she had trained to handle long ago. Her past wasn't something she broadcasted, yet it gave her an inner armor, a calm that seemed almost unnatural to those who had never witnessed it. And though she did not yet know the depth of what would attempt, she was ready, prepared, silent, unmoving. For the first week had been both frustrating and fascinating. He didn't yet realize he had awakened something in Caroline Hayes that, once triggered, would leave him utterly unprepared. In the quiet of his bedroom, he replayed every encounter, planning his next move. Caroline, unknowingly, had become the challenge he craved, the obstacle he intended to conquer. And Caroline, as she closed her classroom door and set her lesson plans neatly on the desk, simply waited, knowing that some battles were inevitable, and that patience, precision, and presence were sometimes stronger than any physical fight. Taylor's life outside Lincoln High was a storm that rarely paused. At home, the walls seemed to close in on him, the absence of his father leaving an unfillable void, and his mother's exhaustion making her compassion distant and fragmented. She worked 2 jobs, barely seeing him awake and often missing the warning signs that he was sinking deeper into the streets. Wasn't ignorant of his circumstances. He understood that life was unfair, that some people were given advantages he would never see. Anger became a shield, a weapon, and a way to stake claim over a world that otherwise ignored him. School had become both a battlefield and a stage, thrived on attention, though rarely the positive kind. His reputation as the troublemaker meant his actions were always scrutinized, but the scrutiny only fueled his pride. He could fight, intimidate, or manipulate, and students learned quickly that it was safer to comply than to test him. Teachers, for the most part, tolerated his behavior, some with quiet warnings, others with resigned acceptance. But Caroline Hayes was different. She neither cowered nor flinched. She didn't play along, and that threatened him more than anyone ever had. Every encounter with her was a puzzle. She never raised her voice, never shouted or scolded. Instead, she watched him, listened, and answered in calm, measured tones. The classroom, once his domain of control, no longer bent to his will. His gestures, words, and threats seemed to evaporate against her composure. Felt irritation building, a new, unfamiliar kind that made his chest tighten and palms sweat. He had never met anyone who could neutralize his fury so effectively. And worse, he couldn't make sense of it. Outside of school, his frustration festered. Found himself walking the streets at night, wandering the neighborhoods he knew like the back of his hand. The gang that had been following him since middle school sensed the change. They could see confusion and irritation simmering beneath the surface. One evening, a local gang member, Rico, approached him. "Yo, you good?" Rico asked. "You look off." Clenched his jaw, trying to contain the whirlwind inside him. He wasn't off. He was calculating, waiting, and furious. The teacher muttered under his breath, nearly startling Rico. She doesn't even care. She looks at me like I'm nothing." Rico laughed nervously. "Man, maybe she knows you're full of crap," he said, but his eyes burned with a dangerous intensity. He didn't want to play along. He wanted to make her respond. He wanted to assert himself in a way no one else had dared. "No," said quietly, almost to himself. "She's different. I'm going to make her see me. I'm going to make her feel something." Back at school, his strategy became more deliberate. Began taking risks in the classroom, interrupting lessons, challenging her knowledge, even making personal jabs that he thought would provoke a reaction. The other students noticed the pattern, whispering about the growing tension. Caroline Hayes, however, remained calm. Her eyes followed him, registering his every move. She didn't respond with fear, annoyance, or aggression. Instead, she seemed to anticipate his outbursts, ready for each one without giving him the satisfaction of a reaction. Couldn't read her, and that made him desperate. He started arriving early, lingering in the hallways to catch her alone. He would toss books across the room, make pointed remarks, or position himself near her desk, hopping to trigger an emotional response. But Caroline remained composed. She corrected his mistakes silently, redirected conversations without shouting, and maintained a presence that was quietly commanding. Began to feel frustration like a burning fire in his chest. His usual tactics didn't work. She didn't submit, didn't apologize, didn't fear him. The other students began to take sides, though no one dared to openly challenge Caroline. Some admired her quiet strength, some feared it, and some simply didn't understand it. However, felt the pressure mounting. The longer he failed to provoke her, the more embarrassed he became in front of the class he had always dominated. Pride mixed with anger, and soon that mix became dangerous. Each day, his frustration grew, turning from silent irritation to the full-fledged desire for confrontation. By the third week, the tension had reached a breaking point. The movements became sharper, his words more aggressive. He shadowed her during class transitions, muttered insults when she wasn't looking, and sought any opportunity to assert dominance. Caroline noticed the shift. She understood the signs: clenched jaw, rapid blinking, controlled breathing. Was approaching a moment where he might act out physically. She didn't panic, she prepared. Every instinct she had honed over years of training told her that a direct confrontation was inevitable. But it would have to be handled with precision, control, and restraint. Outside of class, life was no easier. His friends and the gang continued to push him toward violence, encouraging him to prove himself. Every small failure at home, every frustration with Caroline became fuel. He carried his anger everywhere, in the cafeteria, in the hallways, in every whispered conversation. Students avoided him, teachers worried, and Caroline observed silently, her mind always calculating. Didn't yet realize that, while he thought he was testing her limits, he was preparing her to react in a way he could never anticipate. The day that would change everything began like any other. Caroline set her classroom, aligned her materials neatly, and waited for the bell. Lingered outside, fists twitching, jaw tight. He was impatient, angry, and desperate for a reaction. The class watched as he paced, muttering under his breath. Something had shifted in him. It wasn't just curiosity or pride anymore. It was full-blown rage, mixed with a need to dominate, a need to prove that he was untouchable. Caroline noticed the subtle changes, the narrowing of his eyes, the slight forward lean, the barely suppressed tension in his shoulders. She didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't even react. Instead, she spoke softly, starting the lesson without acknowledging him directly. Infuriated, threw a notebook across the room. It bounced harmlessly on the floor, but he felt victorious. Not enough. He needed her to react. She looked up calmly, meeting his eyes, and for a brief moment felt a chill of uncertainty. He realized she wasn't afraid, but he couldn't figure out why. That fearlessness only made his anger grow. He knew he was walking closer to a line he might not be able to control. By the end of the day, his frustration had peaked. The stage was set. Caroline Hayes had not just survived his provocations, she had anticipated them. Every failed attempt, every misdirected insult, every frustrated outburst had only sharpened her awareness. on the other hand, felt the storm within him growing. His pride, anger, and desperation coalesced into a dangerous mix, setting the scene for the confrontation that was inevitable. He had no idea that Caroline's calm exterior masked skills, experience, and instincts that would soon leave him completely unprepared. And so the simmering tension, invisible to most, built quietly, silently, like a pressure cooker waiting to explode. Caroline Hayes, calm and controlled, and Taylor, furious and impatient, were on a collision course. Neither knew exactly how the day would end, but both were aware in some instinctive way that nothing in Lincoln High or in life would ever be the same. The morning sun had barely pierced the grimy windows of Lincoln High when Caroline Hayes entered her classroom, carrying her laptop and a stack of carefully prepared lesson plans. She moved quietly, each step deliberate, her posture a mixture of poise and alertness. The room smelled faintly of chalk dust and disinfectant, the faint hum of the old fluorescent lights blending with the distant shouts and footsteps from the hallways. Today felt different to her. An electric tension lingered in the air, almost imperceptible to anyone else but unmistakable to those who had trained to notice it. Taylor lingered near the doorway, leaning casually against the frame, though the casual pose was a lie. His fists twitched slightly, his jaw tightened, and his eyes followed every motion Caroline made. He had spent the night replaying strategies in his mind, imagining ways to humiliate her in front of the class. Every lesson, every failed attempt over the past weeks had added fuel to the storm inside him. Today, he decided, she would see his power and she would react. He would no longer be frustrated by her calm, he would break it. Students filed into the classroom, whispering nervously, sensing the tension radiating from the two central figures. Sat near the back, pretending to doodle in his notebook, but Caroline noticed him immediately. She had learned to read over the years, the slight flare of his nostrils, the rapid blink, the subtle flex of his fingers against the desk. Each detail told her volumes, was planning something. He wasn't thinking about his assignments, the lesson, or even the eyes of his classmates. He was thinking about control, and he wanted it at her expense. Caroline began her lesson calmly, writing on the board with precise strokes, explaining the day's material in a tone that was firm yet inviting. She addressed the class without glancing at directly, though her peripheral vision captured his every move. He shifted in his seat, muttering under his breath, tapping his pen against the desk with increasing intensity. The energy in the room became charged, the students unsure whether to speak, move, or hide. Some exchanged anxious glances, others leaned forward, unable to tear their eyes away from the brewing storm. As the lesson progressed, grew impatient. His notebook slammed onto the desk, startling a few students. "This is stupid," he shouted, his voice cutting sharply through the hum of Caroline's calm explanations. The class froze. A few students gasped, a couple whispered hurriedly. Caroline didn't flinch. She paused, turned slightly, and fixed with a steady gaze. Her eyes, calm yet commanding, seemed to absorb the heat of his anger rather than reflect it. Felt an unusual unease in her stare. She wasn't afraid, but there was a warning implicit in every second she held his gaze. He stood abruptly, knocking his chair back. "You think you're better than me?" he yelled, stepping closer. "You think I'm just some kid you can control?" The classroom erupted into whispers and nervous shuffling. His face was flushed with fury, every muscle in his body was taut with tension. Caroline remained unmoved. She took a single, measured step toward him, not aggressive, not defensive, but deliberate. Her calm presence, rather than diminishing his rage, only seemed to intensify it. His plan to provoke a reaction was failing again, and that failure stung more than he expected. "What's wrong with you?" shouted, his voice rising, shaking the fragile calm of the classroom. "Why don't you ever?" He didn't finish the sentence. Caroline's voice, soft but carrying an undeniable authority, interrupted him. "I want you to sit down and breathe." The words were not a suggestion, they were a command. Chest heaved. He could not understand why she wasn't afraid, why she wasn't angry. Anger, frustration, confusion, they collided inside him, building a pressure he couldn't contain. He lunged forward suddenly, slamming his hand onto her desk and pointing in her direction. "I'm not listening to you. "You're gonna listen to me," he shouted, his voice cracking with intensity. Caroline didn't move backward, she didn't even flinch. She simply maintained her stance, her body poised, her weight balanced evenly on both feet. Felt the walls of the classroom shrink, the space around him tightening. The students were frozen, witnessing a dangerous confrontation unfold. Even those who had seen rage before could sense that something was different, something far more serious than usual. Driven by a mixture of pride, anger, and desperation, advanced further. "You think you're untouchable, I'll make you." He stopped mid-sentence, his hand shooting forward instinctively. Caroline's reflexes, trained long ago in ways no one at Lincoln High could imagine, kicked in. She the motion, grasped his wrist, and applied a subtle but controlled pressure. Froze, surprised. He wasn't prepared for resistance, for a teacher who didn't react the way anyone else had. For the first time, he felt the tiniest hint of fear, but pride and anger still propelled him forward. The struggle escalated quickly. Grabbed her throat, expecting compliance or fear, not realizing that his actions had crossed a line. Caroline's body tensed slightly, but her expression remained calm, almost serene. Strength, fueled by rage, met a counter he couldn't perceive. Precise positioning, balance, and instinctive control. Every second stretched, and the classroom seemed to hold its collective breath. Caroline's training, buried beneath years of civilian life, surged to the surface in a way that was instinctual rather than conscious. Didn't know what hit him. He only knew that he was suddenly off balance. "Let go," Caroline said softly, her voice steady and firm. Her calmness was unsettling. Expected a scream, a cry, a reaction, but none came. He tightened his grip in panic, only to realize that Caroline's movements were already controlling the situation. She didn't struggle, didn't fight, didn't shout. She simply applied subtle shifts of leverage, redirecting his force without apparent effort. Own momentum worked against him, and suddenly he was unable to maintain his hold. The classroom erupted in whispers as students tried to comprehend what was happening before them. His chest heaved, his anger now mingled with confusion and fear. He realized he had miscalculated. Caroline Hayes wasn't just calm, she was prepared. She had anticipated this, not just in theory but in instinct, using techniques he couldn't name, movements he couldn't predict. He tried to step back, to pull free, but every motion was countered seamlessly, silently. The reality hit him like a thunderclap. He had no control, not over her, not over the situation, and not over his own pride. For the first time, felt truly powerless. Caroline's eyes met his, steady, unflinching, and commanding. She wasn't trying to hurt him, she was controlling him, neutralizing the threat he posed without a hint of aggression. His mind raced. He had been the predator, the dominant figure, and yet here he was, trapped by someone he had assumed was weak. His rage faltered, replaced by a dawning realization. He had underestimated her completely. The bell rang in the hallway, though no one moved. Caroline maintained control, her presence filling the room, every muscle balanced, every motion precise. Classmates watched in awe and disbelief. Some whispered, some gasped, some silently prayed for him to release her. His mind struggled to reconcile what he saw with what he thought he knew. She wasn't just a teacher. She was something else entirely, someone who had been trained to handle situations exactly like this. And in that suspended moment, Taylor understood something fundamental. The challenge he had believed he posed to Caroline Hayes had become a trap for him. Every calculated move, every attempt to provoke, had led him to this point of vulnerability. Caroline's calm was not submission. It was preparation, precision, and quiet power. The stage was set for a confrontation that would leave everything he thought he knew about strength, control, and authority. The classroom felt smaller than it had ever been. Every student's eyes were fixed on the two figures at the center of the room, their collective breath held in anticipation. Caroline Hayes remained composed, her calm presence a silent anchor in the middle of chaos. Taylor, however, had lost all restraint. His frustration, rage, and desperation collided in a violent surge that had been building for weeks. The notebook he had thrown moments before now lay forgotten on the floor, trampled by his boots as he stepped forward, fists clenched. His voice cracked as he shouted, "You think you're untouchable. You think you can just stand there and ignore me." The anger in his tone was raw, his words jagged like shards of glass thrown recklessly. Caroline's gaze never wavered. She spoke softly, her voice almost eerily calm. "Step back, take a breath. You're letting anger control you." His eyes widened, not at the words, but at the serenity in her tone. He expected fear, weakness, or hesitation, but there was none. Fueled by a dangerous mix of pride and fury, lunged. His hands shot forward, and before anyone could react, they closed around Caroline's throat. The whiteboard behind her rattled slightly from the force, her body pressed back against it. Gasps filled the classroom, a collective intake of breath as students froze in horror. Some screamed for help, while others watched in stunned silence, unable to comprehend what was happening. Expected immediate compliance, she would struggle, beg, or yield. But Caroline didn't flinch. Her brown eyes, steady and piercing, met his. There was no fear, no panic, no shock. Instead, there was focus, calculation, and a faint edge of something couldn't identify. He tightened his grip, sure that he had won the battle, confident that he had instilled fear. His muscles burned with exertion, veins standing out along his forearms and neck. He could feel her body pressed against his, yet she didn't resist in the way he had anticipated. She simply waited. That waiting unnerved him. For a moment the world seemed to tilt, realized that her calm was unnatural, unsettling. He tried to squeeze harder to elicit the reaction he craved, but something in her posture, in her controlled breathing, and the steady intensity of her gaze froze him. It was a moment of hesitation, a crack in his armor that Caroline had deliberately created. His mind raced. What was this? Why wasn't she panicking? Why wasn't she afraid? In that split second, Caroline activated the instinctive training she had buried long ago. Every muscle remembered what her mind allowed it to forget: the countless drills, the hours of conditioning, the precise movements meant to neutralize threats. Unaware of what was about to happen, was fully exposed. Caroline's hands moved subtly, guiding his grip off balance. She shifted her weight just slightly, planting her feet firmly while rotating her hips to redirect his force. His body, heavy with anger, followed the momentum she initiated. He tried to regain control, tightening his hold, but it was already too late. Caroline's movements were fluid, precise, and unyielding. She used his own energy against him, a technique so subtle that the casual observer would have missed it entirely. Felt his arms tingle, a creeping numbness as his leverage was stripped away. Panic, sharp and cold, cut through his anger. He realized he was no longer the one in control. His mind raced to comprehend what was happening, but the answers eluded him. Caroline didn't raise her voice. She didn't scream. She didn't need to. The room was tense with the unspoken knowledge of authority and skill. His grip loosened slightly, not entirely voluntarily, but because his own momentum was being redirected. He stumbled forward a fraction, a minor shift, but enough to break the immediate threat. Caroline pivoted on her feet with the grace of someone who had performed these motions countless times, placing herself at an optimal angle to neutralize him without harm. The students watched, wide-eyed, frozen in disbelief. His movements grew frantic, instinct overriding strategy, yet every effort he made to regain control was anticipated and countered with minimal motion from Caroline. She was calm, composed, and entirely in command. It wasn't brute force, it was precision. Each adjustment, each movement, each subtle shift in leverage reminded that he was no longer the dominant force in the room. He felt exposed, vulnerable, and terrified in a way he had never experienced. His chest heaved, his breath coming in sharp, shallow gasps. What are you?" he demanded, voice trembling slightly now. Caroline's eyes softened for just a fraction, a fleeting moment of compassion hidden beneath the steely resolve. "I am your teacher," she said calmly, "and right now I am keeping you safe from yourself." He didn't understand. He was still furious, still trying to comprehend, still desperate to assert control. But the initial surge of power that had propelled him forward was gone, replaced by shock, confusion, and annoying fear. Caroline continued to guide him subtly, redirecting his movements, ensuring he didn't harm himself or anyone else. The students began whispering, a murmur spreading through the room. "Is she trained?" one asked under their breath. "She can't just move like that," another muttered, eyes wide. Hearing the whispers, felt humiliation spike alongside fear. He was the one who had sought dominance, who had expected compliance, and now the entire classroom could see him disarmed, not physically injured but stripped of control. Minutes, or what felt like hours, passed in tense stillness. Caroline never lost focus. Her posture, her breathing, her calm demeanor, all signals of complete authority and control, dominated the space. Tried one last surge of anger, a desperate grab, but Caroline shifted his wrist and used a subtle leverage technique to guide him down to the floor. He landed with a soft thud, immobilized, completely neutralized, unable to rise without her permission. The room erupted in gasps, whispers, and stunned silence. His mind reeled. He had faced fights, threats, and confrontations in ways most students couldn't imagine. He had never met someone capable of neutralizing him so efficiently, so completely, and without causing harm. Caroline's calm wasn't weakness. It was the opposite. It was a weapon, silent but lethal in its effectiveness. Realized as he lay on the floor that he had underestimated her completely. Every assumption he had made about control, dominance, and power had been shattered in a matter of seconds. Caroline crouched slightly, close enough to maintain control but careful not to hurt him. Her voice was low, deliberate, and precise. "Breathe, focus, calm yourself. You're stronger than this, but strength without control is dangerous." Felt the weight of her words pressing into him. He tried to speak but couldn't find words that matched the storm inside him. Caroline's presence dominated the room. A silent reminder that force without awareness could never win against someone trained in anticipation, precision, and restraint. In that moment, understood a painful truth. He was no longer in charge. The fire that had driven him to act rashly had been extinguished not by brute strength, but by skill, experience, and composure. He had sought to humiliate and dominate, but instead, he had been taught a lesson he would not forget. Caroline Hayes had not only defended herself, she had taught him in the most visceral way possible that underestimating someone could have consequences far beyond his understanding. The students, meanwhile, sat frozen, absorbing every detail of the confrontation. Some were terrified, some were awed, and some were whispering about the teacher who had turned the strongest, most feared student in the school into a momentary pupil at her feet. His fall from perceived dominance was complete, yet it was executed with such precision and calm that none could dispute her authority. She hadn't yelled, she hadn't struck him violently, but she had asserted her control with the kind of quiet power that commanded respect and fear simultaneously. As lay immobilized, struggling to breathe steadily, he realized he was on the cusp of a transformation. His pride, anger, and desperation had led him here, but he was alive, unhurt, and confronted by someone who wielded authority in a way he could scarcely comprehend. Caroline's calm gaze never wavered. She had won without harming him, without shouting, without fear. For the first time, truly understood that strength wasn't just physical. It was controlled, precise, and sometimes silent. The classroom was silent, yet the tension was palpable, vibrating in the air like a low hum. Taylor lay sprawled on the floor, chest heaving, mind racing in disbelief. Just moments ago, he had believed he was in control, that his anger and strength could bend anyone to his will. But now he was the one disoriented, stripped of dominance by the calm, precise, and deliberate movements of Caroline Hayes. The students' faces reflected a mixture of awe, fear, and utter disbelief. No one had ever witnessed a teacher neutralize a student so efficiently, and certainly not without a single raised hand or angry shout. Caroline's eyes narrowed subtly, a slight flicker of intensity passing across her calm face, a switch that few could detect but that carried enormous weight. It was the same switch that had been trained into her over years of rigorous and grueling instruction, a kind of instinctual alert that activated under threat. Her body remained relaxed, but every muscle was ready to respond, every nerve prepared to act. Aggression had triggered that switch, and now she was fully aware of the power she wielded over the situation. She rose smoothly, her movements precise and controlled. Her feet planted firmly on the floor, her center of gravity low but balanced, and her gaze never left flailing eyes. The shift in her demeanor was subtle but unmistakable, a predator's poise cloaked in the calm of someone entirely in control. Felt the moment she became fully present, fully aware, fully trained. Panic surged through him, clashing violently with his residual pride. He wanted to rise, to strike, to reclaim dominance, but every motion seemed to be anticipated and countered. Caroline's hands moved almost imperceptibly. With a fluid, practiced motion, she rotated his wrist and guided his arm away from her throat. He flinched, startled, but before he could react, she positioned herself slightly behind him, using the leverage of his own momentum. Struggled, trying to twist free, but his strength was useless against the precise angles, body positioning, and instinctual adjustments she employed. He had never felt so exposed, so unprepared, so completely outmatched in his life. The students watched, frozen in awe. Some whispered, unable to believe their eyes. How is she doing that?" one muttered. Another gasped audibly, clutching the edge of their desk. Caroline's presence dominated the room, an invisible force that left immobilized without a single blow being struck. Her training wasn't about violence. It was about control, precision, and anticipation. Every movement had a purpose. Every adjustment neutralized a potential threat. She wasn't just responding. She was guiding, steering, and correcting, using his own energy against him. His mind reeled. His anger, which had fueled every action leading up to this moment, now became a liability. His adrenaline surged in wild bursts, but Caroline's calm, deliberate motions absorbed and redirected it. With a subtle pivot of her hip and a shift of her weight, she guided him to kneel, his arms pinned lightly but effectively. Every attempt to rise or resist met a counterbalance she executed instinctively. Realized with a growing, horrifying clarity that he had underestimated her in every possible way. Her voice cut through the silence, soft but firm, almost a whisper, yet carrying unmistakable authority. "Stop struggling, focus, breathe. You are stronger than this, but strength without control is dangerous." The words were simple, yet they struck him like a revelation. He had always believed strength was about intimidation, about force. Caroline was teaching him, without harming him, that power alone was meaningless without precision, awareness, and control. His pride fought against the realization, but it was impossible to deny the truth he was now facing. With minimal effort, Caroline adjusted his balance once more, ensuring that his movements could not regain leverage. His chest rose and fell rapidly, but his hands, which had moments before been a threat, now hovered uselessly at his sides. Each student in the classroom watched the unfolding scene, eyes wide, hearts racing. The most feared student in the school, the one who had intimidated everyone around him for years, was now completely at Caroline's mercy, and he knew it. Caroline crouched slightly, her posture fluid, alert, and commanding. She said again, "You can either cooperate and learn from this, or you can resist and continue down a dangerous path. The choice is yours." Her calmness, her complete command of her own presence was disarming. His mind spun. He had never met someone who could assert control without raising their voice, without striking a blow, without shouting. He was beginning to understand that Caroline's strength lay not in force, but in mastery, over herself, over the environment, and over him. She then guided him down to the floor completely, using his own movement against him to ensure he could not rise or act impulsively. The technique was subtle but effective, the result of years of training that had honed instinct, anticipation, and control to an extraordinary degree. Felt the full weight of realization. He had been the aggressor, but now he was completely neutralized. His energy, his rage, his force, all redirected and contained by someone he had assumed was just a quiet teacher. Time seemed to stretch as Caroline maintained her calm control. Breaths were sharp, ragged, but he could not move. Every thought raced through his mind, from disbelief to fear to reluctant admiration. He had underestimated her completely. Caroline's body, poised yet relaxed, exuded authority in a way that transcended the classroom. The students whispered among themselves, amazed and terrified, as struggle became more mental than physical. He understood, finally, that he was facing someone who had been trained to neutralize threats precisely, efficiently, and without unnecessary harm. Caroline's eyes softened slightly, but only for a fraction of a second. Compassion, yes, but still complete control. She said quietly, "You are capable of more than anger. You are capable of strength, focus, and control, but you have to choose the right path." Pride, anger, and fear collided. He wanted to deny her, to push back, to reclaim control, but every instinct told him that doing so would be futile. He was overwhelmed by a mixture of shame, awe, and reluctant respect. By the time the bell rang, the classroom was completely still. Caroline Hayes remained in full control, kneeling, immobilized, gasping for air, and the students frozen, processing the incredible scene they had witnessed. His pride had been shattered, but not through pain or humiliation, through precision, skill, and sheer mastery. He had met someone who was untouchable not because of raw strength, but because of perfect awareness, control, and training. In that suspended moment, the students understood something profound. Caroline Hayes was not merely a teacher. She was a force, a presence, a person whose calm mastery could neutralize chaos and violence without a single shout or strike. Taylor, the most feared student in the school, had faced his first true defeat. And while he would later struggle to reconcile the experience, the lesson had been unmistakable. Underestimating someone could have consequences far beyond comprehension, and true strength was measured not in brute force, but in control, precision, and mastery of self. As Caroline stood, every muscle relaxed yet ready, she glanced at the stunned classroom. His chest heaved, sweat glistening on his brow, eyes wide with disbelief. He had expected a fight, a struggle, a confrontation in which he would dominate. Instead, he had faced a force he could not predict, could not overcome, and could barely comprehend. Caroline Hayes had shifted the entire dynamic of the room with calm authority, skill, and instinct honed through rigorous training that could only begin to imagine. The classroom air was thick with tension, still buzzing from the confrontation that had unfolded in a matter of heartbeats. Taylor, the school's most notorious student, lay kneeling, chest heaving, face pale with a combination of shock, humiliation, and disbelief. He had expected a fight he could dominate, a teacher he could overpower, a moment to assert the power he carried like armor. Instead, he faced something he could not name: control. Absolute, flawless, terrifying control. And it wasn't just Caroline's physical ability that overwhelmed him. It was the confidence, calm, and precision behind every movement. Caroline Hayes didn't rush. She didn't panic. She allowed to gather himself just enough to understand his own vulnerability. Her presence radiated authority without aggression, a silent but undeniable command over the space, the situation, and the student before her. Tried to rise, flexing his arms, attempting to reclaim some fraction of dominance. Every twitch, every motion, every surge of anger, however, was anticipated and neutralized before it could manifest. Her body was a living counterbalance, her training manifesting in fluid, instinctive corrections. She moved closer, crouching slightly to maintain control over his center of gravity. Fingers itched to strike, to push, to regain control, but her subtle shifts of posture, weight, and leverage rendered him ineffective. Caroline's eyes locked onto his, unflinching yet not cruel. There was no anger, no malice, only complete awareness and intent. Each student in the classroom felt the weight of her presence. They whispered, held their breath, and tried to comprehend the power she wielded without ever raising her voice. Caroline said softly, each syllable deliberate, measured, yet impossible to ignore. "You are strong, but strength alone is dangerous. Control it, focus it, channel it. Right now you're a danger to yourself and everyone else." His mind raced. He had always believed strength was measured in dominance, in fear, and the ability to intimidate. Caroline was redefining it entirely. She wasn't stronger in brute force. She was stronger in precision, anticipation, and presence. Every instinct he relied on to intimidate had failed him, leaving him exposed, flailing against someone whose skills he couldn't even begin to comprehend. Her hands moved with quiet efficiency. A slight pivot of her hips, a subtle rotation of his wrist, a gentle but firm shift of her weight. Each action neutralized his movements without visible effort. Struggled, his muscles burning from exertion, but she guided his body like water flowing around a rock. The students watched in awe, some whispering frantically, some frozen in shock. This wasn't a fight, it was mastery. Caroline's control was complete, surgical, and terrifyingly calm. The bell had long since rung, signaling the end of class, yet no one moved. Time seemed suspended as Caroline executed each adjustment with military precision. She shifted to the floor fully, ensuring he could not rise, and maintained control of his balance, position, and potential movement. Every action was designed to immobilize, educate, and protect. His chest heaved, sweat dripping down his temples, heart racing in a way that was more panic than exertion. For the first time, he felt completely powerless. Caroline crouched next to him, maintaining perfect posture, keeping him grounded with minimal effort. "Listen carefully," she said, her voice soft but unwavering. "You are not your anger, you are not your fear. You are capable of strength, focus, and precision, but only when you control yourself. Right now, you are a threat to yourself and others. The only way to be strong is to master yourself first." Each word landed with weight. Pride, the same pride that had driven him to challenge her, faltered. He realized, perhaps for the first time, that strength without control was empty, dangerous, and fleeting. The students around them whispered in disbelief. "Is she a seal?" one muttered, voice barely audible. Another shook their head. "She can't just move like that, that's impossible." Caroline's presence was commanding, but she didn't need their validation. Every move, every adjustment, every silent instruction demonstrated a lifetime of training and experience. The difference between fear and respect, between dominance and humility, became painfully clear to every witness in the room. Struggles became less frantic, less aggressive, as the reality of his situation settled in. He was immobilized, controlled, and utterly exposed, not by brute force, not by intimidation, but by calm mastery. Caroline guided him to a seated position on the floor, ensuring that even the slightest attempt to rise would meet resistance. His arms rested uselessly at his sides, his legs bent under her subtle control, and his mind reeled with disbelief. He had thought himself unstoppable. He had been wrong. Caroline's eyes softened slightly, a fleeting trace of compassion piercing the intensity. "You are capable of more than chaos. You are capable of focus, discipline, and strength, but it begins with control over yourself first." His breathing slowed slightly, though he still trembled with residual panic and adrenaline. The lesson was sinking in, though he couldn't yet fully articulate it. Caroline had not humiliated him, she had educated him. She had shown him the limits of raw aggression and the power of mastery. Every student in the room absorbed the scene in awe. His fall from perceived dominance had been complete, but it was executed with precision, care, and control. Caroline hadn't yelled, hadn't struck him, hadn't injured him, but she had made it impossible for him to act without her consent. The lesson was brutal, effective, and unforgettable. It was not a display of physical superiority alone. It was a demonstration of skill, awareness, and the kind of disciplined control that only years of training could produce. His mind was spinning. He had entered the classroom expecting to dominate, to assert himself, to instill fear. Instead, he had encountered someone who had anticipated every move, countered every attempt, and maintained control without aggression. His anger had fueled his downfall, and Caroline's calm mastery had highlighted every flaw in his approach. He realized painfully that he had underestimated her completely, and that his assumptions about strength, control, and dominance had been entirely flawed. Finally, Caroline released her subtle control just enough to allow to breathe, sit upright, and process the situation. "Stand when you are ready," she instructed. Slowly obeyed, legs trembling, hands still shaky, pride bruised but ego intact enough to absorb the lesson. He understood in that moment that confrontation and force alone were meaningless against someone who had trained, mastered, and anticipated. Caroline Hayes had not only defended herself, she had taught him something he could not have learned any other way. The classroom remained silent for a long moment. Students, still wide-eyed, whispered amongst themselves, trying to reconcile what they had witnessed. Classmates saw the shift in him immediately, the fear, the awe, and the grudging respect. Taylor, who had once seemed invincible, had been humbled without injury, without humiliation, and without force. Caroline's mastery had spoken louder than words, more powerfully than anger, and more memorably than any act of intimidation could ever have done. As struggled to regain composure, Caroline spoke again, calmly, clearly, and without malice. Remember this, strength alone is meaningless. Focus, control, and awareness define true power. Today you learned that lesson. Nodded slowly, still shaken, still processing, but understanding. The lesson had been delivered in a way no lecture could have matched and no punishment could have enforced. It was living proof of skill, discipline, and mastery. For the first time, realized something profound. Caroline Hayes was not simply a teacher. She was a force of nature, trained to anticipate, control, and neutralize threats with precision. She was calm, deliberate, and commanding, not through intimidation, but through mastery. His perception of strength, control, and authority had been challenged in the most dramatic and unforgettable way. And he understood in the quiet aftermath that nothing at Lincoln High, or in his understanding of power, would ever be the same again. The classroom was unusually quiet after the confrontation. Taylor sat at his desk, staring blankly at the edge of the table, his fingers drumming a nervous, irregular rhythm. The adrenaline that had fueled his rage earlier was now replaced by a strange, disorienting emptiness. He couldn't shake the memory of Caroline Hayes's calm eyes, the precision of her movements, and the absolute control she had exercised over him. For the first time, he felt powerless in a way that wasn't temporary or superficial. It was deeply humbling. Students around the room were still whispering in awe. Some exchanged wide-eyed glances, trying to make sense of what they had just witnessed. "Did she really do that?" one asked in a hushed voice. Another nodded, voice trembling slightly. She didn't even touch him, and yet he couldn't move. The story of Caroline's SEAL-trained calm and tactical control had already begun to circulate among the students. Whispers spread like wildfire, growing louder and more reverent by the minute. It was a moment that would not be forgotten. Caroline Hayes, standing at the front of the room, allowed a small, controlled exhale. She did not gloat. She did not scold. Instead, she maintained a composed posture, a quiet authority that radiated control without intimidation. Every student felt it, whether they realized it or not. She had demonstrated more than physical skill. She had shown mastery over herself, the situation, and the human element, the most unpredictable variable of all. It was a lesson in power, in restraint, and in presence that could not be taught through traditional methods. His mind was still reeling. His pride, bruised and battered, refused to allow him to fully admit defeat, but a part of him had already acknowledged it internally. He remembered the feeling of being guided, redirected, and ultimately immobilized by someone he had assumed was just another teacher. The shock of that realization gnawed at him. Caroline had neutralized him not through brute force, but through precision, awareness, and calm mastery. That was a concept he had never encountered before, and it unsettled him more than physical defeat ever could. His classmates, meanwhile, were processing the lesson in their own ways. Some were inspired, seeing firsthand what disciplined control and composure could achieve. Others were intimidated, realizing that even the strongest, most feared student in the school could be contained without violence. Whispers turned into low conversations, but no one dared to break the silence fully. Caroline's authority was no longer a theory. It was a tangible presence that filled the room, leaving students in awe of the demonstration they had just witnessed. Caroline approached slowly, her movements measured, deliberate, and calm. She crouched slightly to be at eye level with him, her gaze steady and focused. She said, her voice soft but firm, "What you experience today isn't about humiliation. It's about understanding limits, control, and potential. You have strength, but without awareness, it's dangerous to yourself and to others. You can learn to harness it, but you must start by mastering yourself." Swallowed hard, his throat tight. Pride screamed at him to respond with defiance, but the memory of her calm control, her unflinching precision, and the immobilization he had experienced was too vivid. He could not dismiss it. Her words, measured and deliberate, penetrated the walls he had built around his ego. He felt a strange mixture of fear, respect, and reluctant admiration. For the first time, he questioned not just his actions, but the very way he measured power and dominance. Caroline straightened, signaling the end of the immediate lesson. "Class, I expect you all to take today as an example," she said, her voice carrying the same calm authority that had dominated the confrontation. "Strength, skill, and courage are important, but they are meaningless without control, awareness, and respect for others. Learn this lesson not through fear but through observation and reflection." The students nodded, some quietly, some still in disbelief, but all attentive. The impact of her words was by the scene they had just witnessed. Remained seated for a few more moments, processing everything internally. His classmates were watching him, curious to see how the notorious troublemaker would react after being humbled so completely. Felt a strange sense of vulnerability that he had never experienced before. It wasn't just physical, it was emotional and psychological. He had always relied on intimidation, aggression, and reputation to navigate the world. Today, those tools had failed him completely, leaving him exposed to a force he could not predict or overcome. Gradually raised his head and met Caroline's gaze. There was a flicker of acknowledgement in his eyes, a recognition of the lesson she had delivered. Pride still lingered, but it was tempered by understanding. He realized that submission in this moment was not weakness. It was a step toward learning, toward control, and toward growth. The realization was uncomfortable but undeniable. Caroline had not just defended herself. She had reshaped his perception of strength and authority in a single, unforgettable lesson. Outside the classroom, the story of the confrontation spread quickly. Students told their friends, who told others, and by lunchtime, the tale had reached the cafeteria, the gym, and even the principal's office. Taylor, the feared and notorious student, had been neutralized by a teacher. Not through punishment, not through fear, not through anger, but through skill, precision, and control. Caroline Hayes had become a legend in the school, her presence commanding respect far beyond the walls of her classroom. The impact was profound. For the first time, he reflected deeply on his behavior, his choices, and his perception of power. He remembered the way Caroline had anticipated every move, how she had guided his energy, and how she had maintained calm even in the face of aggression. He realized that strength was not about dominance or intimidation. It was about control, awareness, and discipline. The lesson was uncomfortable, humbling, and transformative. Over the next days, subtle changes began to appear in. He no longer relied on threats to assert himself. He began to think before acting, observing the dynamics of the classroom with a new sense of awareness. His classmates noticed the difference. His aggression, once impulsive and dangerous, became more measured. He still retained his natural energy and presence, but now it was tempered by caution, reflection, and a growing respect for authority and skill. Caroline continued her lessons with the same calm authority, never overemphasizing the incident, but allowing it to resonate naturally. Students learned not just from textbooks, but from observation, witnessing firsthand how control, discipline, and composure could neutralize chaos and instill respect without violence. Became a living example of her teaching, a reminder to others that raw power without awareness was fragile and dangerous. In that classroom, the balance of power had shifted permanently. Had learned that strength alone could be defeated by calm mastery, that aggression could be countered by precision, and that fear was not the ultimate measure of respect. Caroline Hayes had transformed the dynamics of her classroom with a single demonstration, leaving an indelible mark on every student who had witnessed it. By the end of the week, the lesson had settled into the collective consciousness of the school. Taylor's reputation remained formidable, but it was now tempered by humility and newfound awareness. Caroline Hayes's authority had been cemented, not through intimidation, but through skill, calm mastery, and strategic presence. The students' perception of power, respect, and control had shifted irrevocably. They had seen the impossible and understood that mastery transcended brute force. Never forgot that moment, the moment when his rage, pride, and perceived dominance were rendered useless against a teacher who had mastered herself, her environment, and him. Caroline Hayes had done more than defend herself. She had changed him, reshaped his understanding of strength, and left a lasting legacy that would echo throughout Lincoln High for years to come. The weeks following the confrontation unfolded slowly, yet every moment carried weight for Taylor and his classmates. The memory of Caroline Hayes's calm dominance and precise control lingered like an indelible imprint in the minds of all who had witnessed it. Students whispered about the incident, replayed it in their minds, and tried to make sense of what they had seen. Some were inspired, some intimidated, but all recognized the undeniable truth. Caroline Hayes was extraordinary. She had demonstrated that true strength was measured not in raw force or intimidation, but in awareness, mastery, and composure. Himself was changed, though the transformation was subtle at first. In class, he no longer acted impulsively, no longer let anger dictate his actions. His notorious temper, which had once sparked fear and chaos, now simmered under a new layer of awareness. He observed situations before reacting, weighed his words before speaking, and slowly began to recognize the value of restraint. The lessons Caroline had imparted through action, rather than words, had taken root, reshaping his understanding of power and respect. At first, resisted the change, caught between pride and humility. Pride whispered that he should dismiss the lesson, that he should act as though the confrontation had never occurred. But the memory of Caroline's calm gaze, her precise movements, and the complete control she had maintained over him haunted him. The realization that he had been entirely outmatched, not by brute strength, but by skill, discipline, and mastery, settled into a grudging respect that gradually transformed into understanding. Other students watched subtle transformation with curiosity. Those who had once feared him began to see a new side of his personality, one tempered by caution and awareness rather than aggression. His classmates, inspired by Caroline's example, began to approach conflict differently, weighing the consequences of impulsive actions and considering the benefits of calm, deliberate thought. The atmosphere in the classroom shifted, no longer dominated by fear, but guided by respect for skill, composure, and authority. Caroline Hayes continued her lessons with the same calm confidence she had always displayed. Yet, the students now viewed her differently. She was not just a teacher. They saw her as a force of nature, someone whose mastery extended beyond textbooks and lectures. Her authority was cemented not through intimidation, but through demonstration, presence, and skill. Students no longer questioned her commands. They absorbed her lessons, understanding that her calm control was not only a defense mechanism, but a demonstration of true power. Over time, began to reflect deeply on the confrontation. He replayed the moment when his anger had driven him to act rashly, the moment when he had grabbed Caroline by the throat, and the moment when her SEAL-trained instincts had neutralized him completely. Each memory was a lesson in itself. The importance of awareness, the futility of brute force without control, and the transformative power of composure and precision. The experience reshaped his understanding of what it meant to be strong. Beyond the classroom, began to apply these lessons in his daily life. He approached conflicts with measured thought, relied on observation rather than reaction, and started to respect the power of skill and preparation over aggression. His peers noticed the change. Once feared and unpredictable, now commanded respect through presence rather than intimidation. The transformation was subtle yet undeniable, and Caroline's influence became the silent force behind his evolution. The students continued to process the lessons they had witnessed. Some attempted to emulate Caroline's composure in their own ways, realizing that calm mastery could diffuse situations more effectively than shouting or acting impulsively. Discussions in the hallways shifted from gossip to reflection, from awe to curiosity. Students debated the implications of Caroline's approach. Strength without control was dangerous, aggression without awareness was futile, and skill and preparation were more powerful than any display of raw force. Caroline herself remained a constant presence, calm and unflinching, guiding her classroom with the same authority she had always displayed. She never boasted, never reminded her students of the confrontation, yet her impact was undeniable. Transformation, the respect of the students, and the subtle shifts in classroom dynamics were all living proof of the lesson she had delivered, not through fear, not through punishment, but through mastery, presence, and quiet authority. In quiet moments, reflected on the experience with a mixture of humility and awe, he realized that the incident had been more than a confrontation. It had been an awakening. He had confronted what he believed to be his own power and found it lacking against someone who had mastered control, awareness, and precision. Caroline Hayes had taught him that strength alone could never prevail without composure, preparation, and understanding. That lesson would stay with him for a lifetime. The story of Caroline Hayes spread beyond the classroom, whispered among students in other grades, recounted in hallways, and even reaching the attention of faculty and administration. She became a symbol of skill, discipline, and authority, respected not only for her teaching, but for the lesson she had imparted in the most visceral, unforgettable way. Taylor's story became inseparable from hers, a living example of the transformative power of calm mastery over unchecked aggression. By the end of the school year, the changes were evident. Had not lost his edge or personality, but his approach to challenges had matured. He was no longer driven solely by pride and rage. He was guided by awareness, respect, and the understanding that true power lay in control. Students approached him differently, peers respected him differently, and even himself began to appreciate the lesson Caroline had delivered in that unforgettable moment. Caroline Hayes remained at the front of the classroom, her presence steady and commanding. She had not only taught the curriculum, but she had also imparted a deeper lesson, one that transcended textbooks and grades. Strength without control, skill without awareness, and power without respect were meaningless. She had demonstrated mastery in its form, calm, precise, and transformative. Every student who witnessed her in action, and every student who observed transformation, had absorbed a lesson that would remain with them for years to come. In the quiet moments after class, Caroline reflected on the incident. She did not feel pride or satisfaction in humbling. Instead, she felt a quiet sense of fulfillment. Her training, skill, and awareness had been applied to protect, educate, and transform. The outcome was not a victory in the traditional sense. It was a teaching moment, a living lesson in control, composure, and mastery. The classroom had become a crucible in which raw aggression had been tempered by discipline, and in which students had witnessed the extraordinary potential of calm authority. Taylor would never forget the moment Caroline Hayes shifted the balance of power so decisively. The lesson she delivered transcended the confrontation. It reshaped his understanding of himself, his approach to conflict, and his perception of strength. Caroline had shown him, and every student who had witnessed it, that true mastery was not loud, not forceful, and not aggressive. It was quiet, precise, and transformative, capable of changing minds, behaviors, and even the trajectory of a young life. And so, the story of that classroom, the confrontation, and the transformative lesson lived on. Tempered by humility and awareness, Caroline, unwavering in her mastery and calm authority, and the students who had witnessed the extraordinary moment, all carried forward a lesson that extended far beyond Lincoln High. Strength alone was fleeting. Composure, skill, and mastery endured. The memory of that day remained vivid, a testament to the power of calm, precise, and transformative authority, a lesson in control that would echo far beyond the walls of the classroom.